Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be a part of this very important Congress. My name is Wayne Centrone, and I am the Executive Director of Health Bridges International. We, Health Bridges International, are very excited to continue our long-standing relationship of collaboration and association with La Universidad Católica de Santa Maria and the College of Nursing. A very special thank you must go out to Dr. Sonia Núñez Chavez and Señorita Maria del Pilar Borja and the entire faculty and staff of the College of Nursing. It is indeed a true pleasure and an honor to work with you and be in collaboration on such important projects. Health Bridges International is moving into our 10th year as a non-governmental organization and our 23rd year of international development. Throughout our history, we have evolved to focus on programs and projects that really find a systematic and model level of development to address the complex issues of health services access and utilization for communities and individuals living in extreme poverty or marginalized situations. Health Bridges International works to build bridges of collaboration within extremely impoverished and marginalized communities. We are dedicated to sustainability and the development of projects that offer long-term change. To this end, Health Bridges International connects resources to needs through programs and projects that build local-level change agents. Our work is grounded in our 4 pillars of service: training, consulting, connecting resources, and delivering direct care with our in-country partners. HBI is committed to changing the world through collaboration. The mission of Health Bridges International is the facilitation of sustainable improvements in the health of underserved communities through collaboration. To our mission of building sustainable bridges of collaboration and support, we developed a project for supporting families living in extreme poverty and caring for children with complex medical conditions. We call the project the Inez Project. The goal of the Inez Project is to improve the health of economically marginalized, medically complex children in the metropolitan area of the city of Lima. We found that despite the existence of healthcare systems that aim to cover children's basic health needs, often the overall care of these children is substandard due to a host of logistical, financial, and cultural obstacles. Through advocacy, education, and targeted resource allocation, we seek to maximize the patient's appropriate utilization of the existing state-driven, state-funded healthcare system. The Inez Project is a comprehensive model for helping families with children with special healthcare needs access the resources they need and identify the knowledge and skills that will support them in moving toward greater self-directed advocacy. The project is a holistic and individualized model of care delivery that works on the many layers of community, family, and individual. The Inez Project pulls from the traditional medical home model and the notion of an individualized health plan to tailor specific care delivery advocacy needs to medically fragile children in least low resource environments. The model brings together a number of community stakeholders and diverse resources to build a safety net of services and a complex array of support. The Inez model uses a team of providers to identify and address the various needs of the family and the child, and to help them find the skills they need to better advocate for their own care. The development of the Inez Project was based on the combined experiences of our healthcare team, community health workers, and the church. And we found this through attempting to effect the change for medically fragile children. We've been working on this project for over 3 years, and we decided that a more complex, more formalized, more collaborative approach to dealing with the challenging issues of supporting medically complex children was the best way to move forward. The model is ultimately born from our experience in working with extremely marginalized and traumatized families and children, and a deep understanding of the impact of this trauma and the impact it has on their neurophysiological function. In essence, the INES project is a trauma-informed model to help build resiliency in families. HBI grew through a traditional charitable approach. Our idea originally was to help one child, to help that child purchase medication, to help the family find financial stability. And even though we saw improvement in the children initially enrolled in the INES project, we realized that this approach was not sustainable or really helping families gain the knowledge and skills they need to live independently. We realized that in Peru there are adequate medical resources to address the needs of medically challenged children. However, families living in extreme poverty do not recognize their right to access this system, and the system itself fails to provide for these rights. This leads to a dramatic injustice for children living in poverty with fragile medical conditions. So our work has since shifted to focus on helping communities and populations find the tools and resources they need to shape their own futures. And we help to do this by building bridges so that people can walk to a future they define in a manner that best meets their life needs. All of that is really nice, and it sounds great to talk about this in an academic lecture. But what does it mean, and how does it change the lives of people living in deep, scarring levels of poverty with tremendous trauma? Well, quite simply stated, our work grew out of our understanding of the deep impacts that trauma and early childhood adverse events have on families. And before I go any further, I think it's critical to state that not every family living in the experience of extreme poverty has traumatic events in their background. However, most families with children with medically fragile conditions living in extreme poverty are subjected to enormous life stressors, and these stressors have profound effects on life function and life advocacy. So the name of this short talk is Silent Lesions of Emotional and Mental Abuse. What does that mean? Before we go on talking about the impact of trauma and emotional and mental health, let's talk really briefly about normal brain development. Early childhood and life experiences affect the development of the brain and the neural architecture differently. But what we can understand is that early influence provides the foundation for all future learning, emotional and mental behavior, and long-term health. And just like the weak foundation compromises the quality of a house, adverse experiences early in life can impair brain architecture with negative effects lasting long into adulthood. Literally, brains are built over time from the bottom up. The brain is, however, strongly formed through complex relationships and also from our genes. That genetic material expressed from the joining of the DNA of our mother and father and all our past ancestors. Yes, that's right. We are the amalgamation of our ancestors, the good and the bad. Our brains are also strongly formed by the socioeconomic environment that we're raised in. In essence, the stool that is our lives relies on the legs of the stool to be made up of these three factors: socioeconomic, relationship-driven, and genetic. And each one of us has different experiences within these three factors of brain development. Brain structure is comprised of billions of connections or synapses between individual neurons across different areas of the brain. These connections enable lightning-fast communication among neurons that specialize in different kinds of brain functioning. The early years are the most active period establishing neural connections, but new connections can form throughout life, and unused connections continue to be pruned. Because this dynamic process never stops, it is impossible to determine what percentage of the brain develops at what age. More importantly, the connections that form early provide either a strong or a weak foundation for the connections that form later. Essentially, every drop of water that goes into developing the oceans that are our brains, every drop of water is critical and vitally important to our formation. The basic architecture or structure of the brain is through an ongoing process that begins before birth and continues well into adulthood. Neural connections form first, followed by more complex circuits that allow for more adaptive skills and the formation of logic. For purposes of our talk today, we're going to focus on 4 specific areas of the brain: the brain stem, the midbrain, the limbic system, and the neocortex. Again, for purposes of this talk, we are going to simplify our discussion. Early in utero, in the developing womb, the brainstem develops. The brainstem is responsible for crude or regulatory functions. Here, the body controls respiration, salivation, temperature control, blood pressure control, and other autonomic body functions. This is a very primitive area of the body and is controlled outside of our consciousness. We don't want to have to think about breathing. Next to develop is the brainstem. This is an area that is really marked by more integrated function. And in the midbrain is the central nervous system that is marked by motor function. It is an area where the brain is intimately involved with our senses, with vision, with hearing, and with control of our muscles. Next to develop is the limbic system. This is the area of the brain where emotions are centered. This is the portion of the brain that is literally hardwired by our senses through a distribution center called the thalamus. The limbic system controls the basic emotions: fear, pleasure, anger, and our drives: hunger, sex, dominance, care for our offspring. We'll refer to the limbic system as the emotional brain. One very important part of the limbic system is the amygdala. The amygdala plays a key role in the processing of emotions. It works in concert with another critical portion of the limbic system called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an area of the brain that helps to integrate short and long-term memories. It allows us to sort through complex emotions and weigh them against past experiences. Finally, the last area of the brain to develop is the neocortex, or new brain. It is involved in higher functions such as sensory perception, the generation of motor commands, spatial reasoning, conscious thought, and language. For our talk, we will focus on one area of the neocortex known as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is the most complex area of the brain and a place in our neural capacity that is intricately involved in reasoning and executive thinking. And in fact, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for weighing risks and benefits, strategic thinking, and even impulse control. Studies demonstrate that the prefrontal cortex is among the last parts of the brain to develop, in many cases not maturing until well into our 3rd or 4th decade of life. So let's put all of this together in a graphical representation of how the brain responds to a stimulus. A stimulus comes in the form of a sense, hearing, taste, smell, and early on, that stimulus is sent through the thalamus. Early in brain development, the emotional brain is formed. The amygdala rapidly receives that stimulus. As the brain gets more and more mature, the sensory thalamus sends that signal to the hippocampus, where short and long-term memories are engaged against one another, where a short-term response is weighted against a long-term response through influence by the cortex, or the new brain, to come to an understanding of what that means. And then slowly that symbol, that stimulus, is sent down to the amygdala, such that a response happens. When all 4 of these areas develop normally, when the brainstem, the midbrain, the limbic system, and the cortical or neocortex areas develop normally, we see a roughly 2-to-1 ratio of brain development, with the majority of neuronal development in the neocortex, or executive brain, or the lower or more emotional portions of the brain. A brain that has the vast majority of its neural development in the executive functioning areas is a healthy or normal brain. This means we're really driven by our intellectual ability to sort cause and effect and introduce logic to our daily challenges. When structure and predictability, nurturing and enriching emotional, social, and cognitive experiences characterize a child's development, that child grows into a happy, productive, insightful, and caring member of society. A child contributes to all of us. Sadly, however, few families and communities can provide this idealized early life. Indeed, it is in the familial incubator of childhood that most children are frequently manipulated, coerced, degraded, inoculated with destructive beliefs, and exposed to violence. So, what happens when the developing brain is exposed to violence and toxic, unrelenting levels of emotional overload or stress? When trauma, like growing up in a household where one of your caregivers or adults has a mental illness or a substance use disorder like alcoholism, when growing up in a house where sexual or emotional or physical violence and assault are experienced, when growing up in a family where there is neglect or emotional abandonment. In these instances, the brain actually changes. In the first few years of life, 700 to 1,000 new neural connections form every second. After this period of rapid proliferation, connections are reduced through a process called pruning. This allows the brain circuits to become more efficient. This is literally the time in development when the brain becomes more effective. This is also a very vulnerable time. If the brain, in this critical phase of development, is exposed to trauma and overburdening or overwhelming stress, it shunts or refocuses development on critical areas for protection. In essence, the brain shuts down areas of high neuronal function to focus on safety and protection. The neurophysiology and neuroendocrine cascades involved in this stress response are complex, but are strongly linked with a pathway in the body known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. The HPA axis regulates stress hormones, or adrenaline. It is the portion of the body responsible for fight, or flight, or fright, or freeze. The more the developing brain is exposed to traumatizing experiences, the more the HPA axis is kicked in. The more the body is exposed to circulating abnormal levels of stress hormones, the more it changes or alters normal brain development. This process, although quite complex and well beyond the time that we have allowed for this talk, is collectively known as pruning, and it is a use it or lose it phenomenon when the brain focuses on putting energy into developing the portions of the brain that are most needed for survival and homeostasis. There's evidence that long-lasting traumatic stress will create atrophic changes in the hippocampus more than any other parts of the brain. These effects show up in post-traumatic stress disorder, and they may contribute to the hippocampal atrophy or shrinking that occurs in severe depression. A recent study has revealed that atrophy of the hippocampus as a result of depression can be stopped with antidepressant medication. Hippocampal atrophy is seen in people who've been through severe neglect. Evidence is mainly derived from studies using rats, shows that the more severe or more toxic the stress shortly after birth, the greater impact it has on hippocampal function, such that it persists well into adult life. Remember back to a slide I showed you that demonstrated normal brain development occurring at roughly a 2-to-1 ratio, with the majority of neural development occurring in the neocortex. Remember what we said about the development in a normal brain, and how the focus was on creating a brain that could sort through cause and effect and interject logic. What if your brain was wired more like this, with more even split between the emotional focus and the intellectual framework? In traumatized brains, this is a reality and greatly impedes or interferes with adult function. In essence, the brain becomes stuck in an emotional reaction. When this happens, when the response is rooted in emotion, the emotions of fight, fright, flee, or freeze, or even freak out, rather than in rationality, the brain changes. This is a picture of a saber-toothed tiger. Saber-toothed tigers have been extinct for about 10,000 years. Yet for many of you, when I show you this cartoon, your body reacts, just like the threat of being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger is real. Your heart races, your palms get sweaty, your breath accelerates, you generate a fear response. Now imagine if the saber-toothed tiger were real, but it was real in the form of an abusive caregiver. Every day your body would be in a hypervigilant, protective mode. Every day you'd be fearful for your life. Every day would be traumatic. Let's look at a graphical representation of how this happens. How trauma alters the ability of the brain to harness decision-making abilities and makes us more vulnerable to risk-taking and impulse behaviors. As a parent, when you feel your daughter is overreacting or misrepresenting, you have likely met their developing brain in action. Remember, the developing brain quickly takes stimulus and moves it over to the emotional brain or the amygdala, such that our reaction becomes one of emotion rather than intellectual processing. The more that a person is exposed to trauma, the more that the brain actually focuses on reacting at the emotional level. And it sends less of a signal up to the cortex and less of a signal to the hippocampus, such that we can integrate short and long-term memories. And more of that signal, in a more rapid-fire way, goes to the emotional brain or the amygdala, such that our responses become very emotionally driven. Literally, the emotional center of the brain is wired through all of our senses. Now, that sense is also sent to the executive center of our brain, or the neocortex. But when trauma and stress overwhelm the system, it actually shuts down the executive function, and it moves more of the functioning back to the emotional brain. These two imaging views on the slide are of a 3-year-old. Slide on the left is a normal, healthy 3-year-old brain. Note the size, note the color. Now look at the image on the right. It is also a 3-year-old brain. Note the difference in size. Note the difference in color. In the dark areas, you see the more black complexity to the image. That is not a healthy brain. And in fact, it is a diseased brain. This is the brain of a severely neglected 3-year-old. And this is a brain that will greatly interfere with this individual's ability to move into an adult life. For HBI, the development of a model that can effectively support children in traumatic, stress-laden circumstances and situations is key. We've found that traditional humanitarian approaches that address the intermittent needs of medically fragile children do not effectively and holistically respond to the complex trauma that many children and families living in extreme poverty face. With this in mind, we developed the NS Project seeks to support families through a team approach to create ongoing comprehensive care and advocacy. The model brings together community partners and works to form collaborative alliances. In forming the initial NS project, we found that collaborating with local faith-based organizations greatly expanded the opportunity to connect a family with supportive services. Our experiences have shown us that a dedicated, trained health advocacy team working together increases the support and the progress toward better health outcomes and quality of life for the children and families living in extreme poverty and under enormous levels of stress and trauma. When communities and families work together, health resources can be appropriately accessed and utilized, and the overall cost of healthcare can be reduced. In addition, secondary illnesses can be prevented. As a result of these programs, work can be sustained and shared with other communities to grow in a trauma-informed, person-centered way. If successful, each child will graduate from a program with the skills and knowledge to sustain the care for their lifespan. We know that the brain and its enormous capacity is not solely influenced or impacted by the trauma experiences, but the ways in which our brains are formed to respond to and react to such trauma. The sequential and use-dependent properties of the brain result in an amazingly adaptive, malleable organ. An individual's brain develops capabilities suited to all types of situations and environments. Simply stated, children are a reflection of the world in which they are raised. If that world is characterized by threat and chaos and unpredictability, the brain will reflect that by altering the development of neural systems involved in the stress and fear response. Our goal, the goal of Health Bridges International, is to help all children and their families find the healing pathways to reflect a healthy development and support a fully integrated life. We're working to do this through a project we call the Inez Project, and our hope is to heal the silent lesions of emotional and mental abuse before they happen by supporting informed, empowered, and self-advocating families. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this important Congress. Thank you for the work you do in the world, and thank you for really thinking about how families can best be supported. For the social media folks in the audience, you can follow HBI on Twitter and Facebook. At this point, I'd like to take questions. Before I do, a very special thank you again to Dr. Sonia Nunez Chavez and Señorita Maria del Pilar Borja and the entire faculty and staff of the College of Nursing. It is indeed a pleasure to work with you, to learn with you, and to grow together. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.